for the 2022 AGM of Hydrographic Society Scotland branch. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. We will be looking for people to propose and then second motions through the evening. What we need you to do in order to take part in that is to be logged in to your Google account so you can add comments into your YouTube comment section, which should be down the right-hand side of your page. We are going to start with our AGM, and then after the AGM, we have two fantastic presentations from the Ordnance Survey and from the UKHO. But let's start with our AGM. So our agenda will be approval of the previous minutes from 2021. I'll then go through a brief summary of the Chairman's report, the Treasurer's report, election of our office bearers and committee members, and then any other business. I should point out at this point, you may have noticed I'm not actually the chairman. So Simon couldn't join us tonight, and he does send his humble apologies. I'm Nikki, I'm the deputy chair of this branch. So all the documentation for the AGM was sent out 2 days ago to our membership. So everybody should have had lots of time to digest the documents. So we're not going to be showing full reports. We're not going to be showing all the minutes, etc. We are hoping that everybody has had time to digest those. So let's have item number 1 on the agenda, approval of our previous minutes. So as I said, these were circulated 2 or 3 days ago via email to our membership. Now, I'm hoping that nobody has any comments or queries on those minutes. And I would like to ask for a motion, please, to approve those minutes of the 2021 AGM, please. So we're looking for somebody to put the name forward as a proposer and somebody to put the name forward as a seconder for those minutes. Now, I can't see any comments coming through. So if I quickly escape that, go to my StreamYard, I think we have approval, and we can move on to the next slide. Right. So again, the Chairman's report was sent out in full. So I'm not going to read out the full 2 or 3 pages and show you the photographs. I hope you've had a chance to read it. So just as a summary, again, another year of minimal face-to-face interaction, but we did manage to continue with events through the year. Great support as always from our members, corporate members and sponsors throughout the year. We did have some movement on the committee, but we are standing now at 22 members going into 2022, quite appropriate. So we started off Q1 by running 3 joint events with our Norwegian friends, the Norwegian Offshore Survey and Positioning Forum. In January, we had an entertaining presentation from Ocean Phoenix, followed by Viewport 3 and Savant. In February, we had 3 presentations again from SBG Systems, Salmara Subsea, and then ZUPT. And then in March, that was followed by Pangeo Subsea, Ocean Floor Geophysics, and Fugro. Moving into Q2, this would have been our most kind of active quarter, really, of interaction with people outside the society. Hydrofest would normally have been held in April at the university, but for a second year running, we had to deliver the presentations online, which was okay. It was well received by the universities, and they had the opportunity to submit questions to a panel of committee members afterwards. Fingers crossed, we managed to get a real Hydrofest this year at the uni. In May, we would have run our schools lecture day, rather a noisy event, but unfortunately for a second year, we had to cancel the face-to-face interaction. But we did provide the schools, the secondary schools, with an activity pack, short PowerPoint with fun videos in there, telling them all about hydrographic survey, what a surveyor did, how they could become one. And then we had a quiz at the end that they could take part in. And we handed out some checks to local schools to contribute to their STEM departments. So it was all very worthwhile. So going into Q3, we continued our collaboration with NOSP with 2 more events. In May, we had BP, Ocean Infinity, Sonodyne, and Ocean Floor Geophysics. That was a busy old night. And then in June, we had the National Decommissioning Centre, Fugro, and Shell UK. So then we took a break over the summer and went back into September with, thankfully, a face-to-face event, which was a great day, the golf event, 10 teams, unique systems winning with some great high scores, nearest the pin and long drive prizes, and sponsorship. These events are made possible by sponsors. We had Ashted, Norbit, STR, and Unique all sponsoring components of that day, and it was great. And thanks to Alan McDonald for organising yet again. Shame he couldn't actually take part in the day. Our student award programme has been running for the last 5 years. Last year, unfortunately, because of delays in the students actually starting their teaching, we just didn't get any. We didn't get any submissions for the student award. It was a real shame, but we have been working with the universities over the last year. We have changed our submission time to the end of their term, which will be June this year. And we have relaunched the award programme to students in Aberdeen and Glasgow. And fingers crossed, we'll have some submissions again this year. We had planned our annual joint venture with SUT and IMCA for November, back in November 21. But unfortunately, I think everybody was just Zoomed or Teamed out, and due to the lack of registration, we actually had to cancel that event. However, we will be focusing on a face-to-face event in November this year with the 3 organisations, again, putting that event together. Another initiative that we have launched over the last 2 or 3 months is the Emerging Talent Award. And we're looking for the best and brightest individuals who've joined the hydrographic and energy industry in the last 3 years. We've got some nice prizes and runner-up prizes, and we're looking for submissions very soon, by the end of this month, in fact. So we look forward to seeing submissions for that. We really do intend to return to some face-to-face events. We'd hoped that tonight would be face-to-face, but alas, timings just weren't quite right. But we are looking to hold our annual members' dinner on March the 10th at the Chester Hotel in Aberdeen, and more information on that will follow this week. We have a programme of events planned for what remains of Q1 and Q2, and those will be published through our usual channels. Simon would like to thank the Hydrographic Society committee for their hard work. We'd like to thank our individual members for support, corporate members, and of course our sponsors. I'd like to thank Simon for guiding us through the last 12 months, and also Kevin, Kate, Matt and Laura for making sure we get our to-do list actually ticked off. Right, so now we are on to our Treasurer's report. Again, this was sent out in full by Kevin as part of the information pack. This is a summary that's on the screen, but I'm going to hand over to Kevin now, hopefully through the powers of StreamYard. I'm going to hand over to Kevin, and he will talk us through the reports in more detail.
Thank you, Nikki. Okay, as Nikki has alluded to, there's been very limited events on this year, so this will be a quick summary of where we are. So there is no monthly meetings face-to-face, no annual dinner, Hydrofest or quiz or even the SUT. So the only event that did take place was the golf, and that drew an income through tickets of 1,380 with sponsorship of £850, and then a limited income from our interest on our accounts, which we total at 2,237.19. So when we look at our expenditure, again, similar to the income, very limited on the expenditure due to the event. So we did, as Nikki pointed out, gave some student awards out, so that amounted to £500. And then there was some of the golf costs as well, which was 975. And just due to some of the transactions that were taking place through our Eventbrite, we have £80.38. So expenditure was 1,555 this year, showing on there. So the account balance is from the main account of 24,364.65. Our education account of 9,987.69, with our PayPal account at the end of the year of 1,039.69. So totaling 35,392.3 pence. What I've done this year, though, is just highlighted on some of the income with due from some of the events. Some of those have been paid through. We have the events of 2,097 outstanding, and also some of those events of 12 months and older we still have outstanding and are being chased, of 3,438. So that's the minutes. So if there's any questions on those, if we can have them now in the comments, or if we can have them proposed and seconded, please. Thank you, Damien. That's proposed. And if we could have a seconder, please. That's great. Okay, so moving on now back to Nikki.
Hopefully you can all hear me again. So we move on now to section 4 of the AGM, which is election of the committee members, which is including the office bearers. Now, as you can see from the slide here, Simon has offered to continue as our chair for another year. I've offered to continue as the deputy chair. Kevin has offered to continue looking after the money as our treasurer. The role of deputy treasurer is vacant, and so we went out looking for volunteers for that role. Kate has offered to continue as secretary. She actually just assumed that role in the last few weeks, taking over from Laura, who's now on maternity leave. So the role of deputy secretary is also up for election. Pleased to report that Lynn has put herself forward to fill the role of deputy treasurer. We do not at this point have any offers of a deputy secretary role. So Kate is awfully keen for somebody to be her backup. So if anybody would like to put themselves forward in the comments, that's fine. If not, we will leave the position up for election, or we'll leave it vacant for now, but we would like to try and fill that as soon as possible. So let's move on, looking at our committee. Look at that lovely bunch. We have Lynn, Ashley, Andy, Matt. I'm not going to read out all the names. We have slides for that purpose. So these are the people at the top that offered to continue on the committee this year, and we're very grateful. We did have 8 people stand down in 2021 for various reasons. So moving on to the next slide, we've had 2 people join the committee, which is Andy Irvin and Carl Zudwig. So at this point, we would like to propose that the office bearers, the existing committee members, and Lynn, who has put herself forward as our Deputy Treasurer, we'd like to confirm them in those positions. We are open to any other, if anybody else would like to stand for election to the committee, or if there's any objections from the floor. We'd like to give you the opportunity now to put those in the comments on the YouTube channel, and we'll give a little bit of time for that to happen. If there are any objections, or if everybody is jumping to their keyboards to help Kate out in the Deputy Secretary role, we would be delighted. But we'd also like to have a motion, please, to approve the office bearers and committee for 2022. So if we could have somebody, please, a proposer and a seconder for that motion, please. Again, putting your name in the comments. And my little team in the background here will be messaging me when that has been achieved so that we can move on. Can somebody propose and somebody second the motion for the office bearers? Achieved, says Kate. Well done. Thank you, everybody. Right. Last item on the agenda is any other business. And this is obviously open to our membership. So if there's anything that anybody would like to bring up, again, if you could please put that in the comments. I did mention earlier in the chairman's report that we will be running our annual members' dinner on Thursday, the 10th of March. Fingers crossed. So the flyer with that information will be coming out tomorrow, and we will be looking to take bookings from that point and looking to secure some sponsorship from that point. But we're very excited. We need to have some face-to-face time. Right, I'm hoping that the silence has means that there is nothing else that's been raised from the floor. And I see that Mr. Carl Zudwig has proposed himself for Deputy Secretary. Is that correct, or is that just a joke, Damien? But we can take that up at the next committee meeting. It's correct. Fantastic. So nothing else has been raised. Let us therefore move on to the next item of the evening. We'll turn our attention to our two technical presentations. So this topic has actually been on our to-do list for quite a while now. So we are absolutely delighted that we've managed to grab both of our speakers tonight on the same evening. And we're going to explore the history of height and its measurement in the UK. So first of all, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Mr. Mark Graves. He's been the Senior Production Consultant for Geodesy at Ordnance Survey for the past 8 years. He was a cartographic surveyor for 8 years before moving into Geodesy team. He holds an MSc with distinction in Engineering, Surveying and Geodesy from Nottingham University's Institute of Engineering, Surveying and Space Geodesy, and is also a member of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So Mark specialises in geodetic GNSS computations and analysis, coordinate reference system realisation and datum transformations. He's been responsible for several national GNSS network adjustments, including 2 internationally ratified realisations of the ETRS 89 coordinate reference system in the UK. Mark is a member of the team responsible for managing and developing the OSNet GNSS network since its inception. So Mark's presentation is titled A History of Height in Great Britain, and now using the powers of StreamYard, Damien, I hope I will be handing over to Mark.
Hello. I think I'm live. I'm going to assume that I'm live. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me. It does seem to me rather strange that I'm going to do a presentation that involves talking about, in some aspects, mean sea level to a virtual room full of hydrographers and hydrographic surveyors. And I'm sure there are plenty of people listening and watching tonight who have forgotten more about mean sea level than I will ever know. But this is, of course, a little bit of a background and history on how we've measured and realised height on land in Great Britain, United Kingdom. And I know the talk coming after me from the guys at the Hydrographic Office is obviously going to deal with height offshore. So without further ado, let's see if the technology works. There we go. I think one of the initial ideas or inspirations for this talk was the fact that the main height datum for mainland Great Britain, which is at Newlyn in Cornwall, known as Ordnance Datum Newlyn, was 100 years old last year. In April 2021, it marked 100 years since the completion of the measurements that led to mean sea level and led to that little brass bolt, which is, you just see it in this tiny picture here, which is inside this anonymous little hut on the end of Newlyn Pier, right down at the tip of the country. That's bolt 0. That's where every single height on every OS map and any height that's been measured for the last century almost, they all relate back to this bolt here. But first of all, I need to kind of, rather than dive straight into the history, I'm going to just do a little bit of background about the technical reasons for choosing mean sea level, why choose that and not anything else. And a couple of other little kind of background history as to why we ended up with this magical bolt in this tiny little hut at the end of a pier at Newlyn Harbour. So first of all, one of the obvious questions is, why pick mean sea level? If you start from the assumption that for height, everybody has to at least agree where 0 is, where does height start? Then why does it have to be mean sea level? Why not high tide, low tide, or any point in between? Or, as the second line says there, rather a glib comment, why not just pick, say, second step of St. Paul's Cathedral and bang a nail in there and call it good, say, right, that's 100 metres and off we go. So as long as everyone agrees, what does it matter? Why do we tend to choose mean sea level? And it's generally because most of us, hydrographers perhaps excluded, are land-based creatures. We tend to almost naturally think of this 0 surface in between where we live. We say hills have height, oceans have depth, and that just seems like a natural thing to say. And as it says there on the slide, it implies this 0 surface living somewhere in between those two extremes. And also, you know, if you stood on the shore, generally you walk away from the shoreline. The only way to go is up. So it kind of feels natural that that's where height starts. So that's kind of the natural kind of human reason to choose somewhere that's close to where your feet get wet, that's close to sea level. Of course, there's a scientific reason as well. And I'm just going to try cover some of that. I'm not going to hopefully dive into a technical rabbit hole about why we choose mean sea level and all the science behind it. But what I call the journey from Earth to map, it includes this model, and it includes a very good reason why mean sea level is almost the perfect point to choose as our datum, because that journey has to take us from the irregular, lumpy, uncooperative, unstable surface of the Earth to a nice, regular, modelled environment for a map or a position. And the first kind of step on that journey, the first model that we need to adopt is a surface that's called a geoid. It's a little bit of a hypothetical concept. It's not something physical. You can't touch it. You can't stick your finger on it. It's directly related to the varying gravity on Earth. Obviously, Earth's gravity field is not constant. It varies wherever you go. And the diagram here is the colours represent different intensities of gravity, and it's greatly exaggerated. But gravity is not constant. It does vary. That's mainly due to the physical makeup of the Earth and its internal mechanisms and things like that. But the surface devised by a constant level of gravity is called the geoid. And what might seem contradictory is that it's irregular, as indicated by the diagram there. It changes wherever you go, but it's also level, and that sounds like it shouldn't match up, because when you think of something that's level, you naturally think of a flat surface, a table or a tennis court or something like that, and you say, well, how can it be regular and level? But in this sense, level means that there's no work is done under gravity as you're moving across it. So for any of you that have done any surveying, any leveling in particular, the first thing you do when you set your instrument up is adjust 3 feet on the instrument or on the tri-back, on the theodolite. There's usually a little pond bubble that you have to try get in the middle there, and you're aligning that instrument with the local direction of gravity. So its observations are parallel to and take place on the geoid. So it's the natural physical surface where all our observations and all our modeling takes place. So this is why it also becomes the natural and the very sensible surface to say, well, that's zero height as well. Let's take that as zero. And the reason this matches up with mean sea level is that I said earlier that we say hills have height and oceans have depth. So that's effectively the topography of the Earth. And the geoid is that surface in between that describes the basic physical shape of the Earth. You strip off the topography and you're kind of left with the geoid. And a quite happy coincidence or science is that, in theory, if the oceans of the Earth were only under the influence of Earth gravity, so no tides, no influence of the moon or the sun or the planets or all those other gravitational attractions that give us tides and currents, if the oceans were just sat there only under the influence of Earth gravity, then the shape that would be adopted is very close to the shape of the geoid. So if you can measure the average of that shape, mean sea level, which evens out all the tides and all the currents, then that effectively on land gives you a point that's also on the geoid. So you can then use that as the starting point for your height. So that's why this point here, where mean sea level hits the land, that's where we'll have our tide gauge. And eventually, if we measure mean sea level there, then we know that point is on the geoid, and from there we can go off across the country, spreading height around, and they'll all be related back to this point here. Just a little bit, I'm sure this is obvious to many of you, but measuring sea level is kind of as fairly straightforward as it sounds. You basically have something floating up and down on the tide, and you just need to measure the changing of the height of the float or the device or whatever it is. And a standard setup for a tide gauge is, as shown by this diagram here, you've got the float going up and down, and there's some kind of recorder at the top, which is what I think this is a picture of one of the instruments that used to live in the hut at Newlyn. And you know the relationship between this instrument here and your chosen reference point at the tide gauge. And over a long period of time, this float's going up and down and up and down. You mean out all those measurements, and that, as the name suggests, gives you mean sea level. And you then apply that difference to your reference point, which for Newlyn, I think is 4.7 something meters. And off you go. You've got your zero height, and you can use that for the rest of the country. So a little bit of the history, the height in Great Britain, the height in UK, has not always been at Newlyn. It started in 1840 in Liverpool. And a few slides ago, I mentioned that it was almost a throwaway comment that said, why can't we have the second step of St. Paul's Cathedral as our point of zero height, and just this arbitrary point? Well, in actual fact, that's what was done first of all. In 1840, someone put a mark, or there was already a mark on St. John's Church in Liverpool, and they said, right, that's 100 foot above datum. Off we go. And that was it. There was this arbitrary point. Unfortunately, St. John's Church is not there anymore. It's now been, I think, it was demolished quite some time ago. It's now St. John's Gardens in the centre of Liverpool. But this period was also the period where surveyors, scientists were just starting to understand the science and some of the relationships about why mean sea level does make a good datum. Sir George Airy, who went on to become Astronomer Royal, did studies around tide gauges of Ireland, and quickly came to the conclusion that mean sea level between them was fairly unchanging, and was therefore a very good and stable surface to use as the zero height. So just 4 years later, they took just 10 days of tidal observations at Victoria Dock, again in Liverpool, and declared that to be 43 feet higher than the original datum on St. John's Church. And that became the datum for the entire country. And unfortunately, Victoria Dock is no longer there. It was filled in quite some time ago, but that's roughly where it is today, just south of Trafalgar Dock, apparently. And this stayed the datum for Great Britain until Newland took over in the early 1920s. Excuse me. So by the start of the 20th century, by the early 1900s, it became clear that benchmarks and heights and any other observations and markers linked to Liverpool they'd fallen into disrepair. It was becoming clear as kind of science advanced and the understanding about sea level and leveling and heights was advancing. It was clear that the Liverpool heights and the Liverpool datum was unfortunately no longer fit for purpose. So the Ordnance Survey established 3 brand new tide gauges, one at Newlyn, obviously, one at Felixstowe on the east coast, and one all the way up at Dunbar. And the idea was that the 3 sites, the 3 tide gauges, would all measure and determine mean sea level, and they would all act as a combined reference with each other. But when the first measurements and the first comparisons were done, Dunbar was different. Unexpectedly, there was a 25 centimetre difference between mean sea level as measured at Felixstowe and at Newlyn as there was at Dunbar. And at the time, this was over 100 years ago, they couldn't, to be honest, they couldn't explain this. The science and the understanding of how mean sea level can vary and the real fine mechanics behind it, and also the science of understanding the potential errors in the leveling, because there's quite some distance clearly between here and here, so your leveling is not going to be perfect, means that it's the understanding at the moment is it's now the difference is explained by a combination of the two. There very likely is a real difference in mean sea level between down here in the south and all the way up towards Edinburgh. But the bulk of the difference is quite likely due to errors in the historical leveling measurements. So it does strictly mean that on a scientific level, at least, the datum, the height datum, has got a slight tilt in it. And it drifts a little bit away from mean sea level as you get further north. But that's really, it's kind of been argued back and forth between various academics for decades, really. So it's really only of concern at the scientific level, and generally the heights across the country are still, fit for purpose, and they still realise ordnance datum Newlyn to a satisfactory level. But what they ended up doing at the time was just choosing Newlyn as the single reference. So they effectively chose to ignore Dunbar and Felixstowe, and they just went with the reference at Newlyn. And Newlyn's a good choice. It's obviously most of Devon and Cornwall is good solid granite bedrock, so it's a good solid surface to sit on. It's very near the actual Atlantic, the continental shelf, so the tide experience is a full ocean tide. It's not distorted, or it doesn't get any noise from estuaries or the near coast or anything like that. So from 1915 to 1921, every day or several times a day, that little float goes up and down and makes its mark on the piece of paper and the rotating drum on the measuring equipment in the little hut. And I think at least once a day, or perhaps several times a day, some surveyor had to trog on down to the end of the pier and write all this down and enter it in a logbook and make all the calculations. And after 6 years, we had a height for mean sea level. Now, as it says here, the actual period of every single tidal component, because the tide is made up of about 36 measurable components. For example, the influence of the moon is obviously perhaps component number one. That's one of the biggest effects. And then there's the sun, and there's the sun and the moon together, and the planets, and there's all kind, and they get smaller and smaller and finer. But overall, there's at least 30 some different components. And very strictly speaking, to capture the cycles of all those different components, you should really measure sea level for 18.6 years, and that's when the whole thing starts to repeat again. But 6 is still an extremely good answer. After 6 years, you're going to get all the major components of the tide and get a very good, accurate answer for mean sea level. So the compromise at Newlyn and the other tide gauges was they stuck at 6. And that's officially called Ordnance Datum Newlyn for obvious reasons, and Ordnance because it was Ordnance Survey that did back in those days did the measurements. And here we are. The bolt zero inside the hut is 4.751 meters above that mean sea level measurement. So you could stick your leveling stave on that bolt and head on down the pier and out into Newlyn, leapfrogging the height across the country as you go, and your starting height would be 4.751. But of course, having height just at Newlyn, just at a single point, is not really much use to anyone. So clearly we need to spread that height across the country. A geodetic term is to realize the datum. So you have a datum and you've defined it at a point, but you need that datum to be accessible to your users. But a user needs to go to a known point to capture that height and to realize that datum and then take it off onto site or wherever they need to go. So this led to well over 500,000 benchmarks ultimately across GB, all tied back to that single bolt in Newlyn. And I'm sure many of you have seen these cut marks on walls and buildings. Anywhere along a main road, which would have been a leveling line, you're bound to get one of these every few hundred meters. And the name benchmark, apparently, or so I understand, comes from the arrow mark was and perhaps still is an indicator of government. Quite a lot of government and naval property would have an arrow on it. So the bench, this horizontal line, was added. That's the actual marker of the height. So then you get the term benchmark. And we also have 200 of these, which are fundamental benchmarks, which were kind of the zero order markers. So a leveling line would run for a certain distance and ultimately link up with one of these. These were kind of the junction points for all the leveling lines. And as you can see, this, I forget where this one is, but this was one that we had to open up a few years ago to repair the little pillar that goes with it. And you can just see the bolt there, that has a height, but the master reference bolts are buried in this concrete chamber covered by this hefty slab here. There's another bolt, and I think in there is a piece of flint. And this whole thing will be resting on bedrock. So these are about as stable as it's possible to get in terms of height reference. And although the 500,000 benchmarks, the Ordnance Survey don't use them anymore, we haven't leveled them for decades or maintained them for a long time, the fundamental marks are still very important. They're still the physical marks that help us realise Ordnance Datum Newlyn today. We do it differently now, and I'm going to come on to that. But these marks are still kind of live, living marks, and we try obviously protect them at all costs because they're the physical embodiment of Ordnance Datum Newlyn. And I just need to point out that ODN really only relates to mainland Great Britain as well. The larger islands around the coast are the Orkneys, the Outer Hebrides, the Shetlands, Isle of Man, the Scilly Isles, for example. They all have their own similar mean sea level based datums because it's very difficult, if not near impossible, to level over long distances of water. So whenever you get to a significant boundary of some water, your datum has to stop when it comes to traditional leveling. So that's why the outlying islands have their own specific datums. In the satellite age, though, because obviously everyone's now using GPS or GNSS, because GPS isn't the only system anymore, we need to do something slightly different. The main reason for that is that the height reference surface, when you've got your position from your GPS receiver, the height reference surface is not related to mean sea level. It's not the geoid. It's a simpler shape called the reference surface is the ellipsoid. And earlier on, I mentioned this journey from Earth to map, and the first stop on that journey is the geoid. And the second stop on that journey is the ellipsoid. The aim is to have an ellipsoid that fits the geoid in an average way as closely as possible. So clearly, though, it's a different surface, and there's physically a difference between the two. And in Great Britain, in the UK, that's very approximately about 50 meters. So I'm trying to remember which way around it is. I think the ellipsoid is very roughly 50 meters below mean sea level or below the geoid in this country. And another reason for not really wanting to use the ellipsoid is that the heights are what you call, they're not really natural. And by that I mean it's perfectly possible to have two points with ellipsoidal heights, and one point based on the ellipsoidal height might appear to be above the other. So you would expect, being a natural process, a physical process, you would expect water in a pipe, for example, to run from the highest point to the lowest point. But with ellipsoidal heights, there's a chance you could actually get the opposite, because of the deviation between the natural geoid and mean sea level surface and the regular surface of the ellipsoid. It could be the other way around. So we still need to relate back to this physical gravity-based natural surface, which is geoid and mean sea level. And that includes our surveyors. All our surveyors, 250 surveyors, are all using high precision GPS GNSS receivers. Are able to achieve positions literally down to a centimeter or so. But all their heights and positions are converted back to this natural geoid mean sea level surface. And the way we do that, there's various ways of doing that. And it obviously depends on what kind of accuracy you're trying to achieve. But in this country, we have what's called a Geoid Model. And our particular model is kind of sometimes you might hear it described as a rubber sheet. It's a grid of varying parameters. And the same model also models the difference in plan between the GPS model and our mapping eastings and northings. So it's all combined into one. But the high component is known as OSGM15, and the GM stands for Geoid Model. And essentially every kilometer we have a value of the difference between mean sea level ODN and the ellipsoid. So any ellipsoid heights that come off our surveying kits pass through this model and get converted to correct ODN heights, natural heights above mean sea level, above ODN. And I said earlier about the different islands. So the Outer Hebrides have got their own datum, and Shetland and Orkney have as well, and Isle of Man and Isles of Scilly. their mean sea level data models are also incorporated in OSGM 15. So even though ODN is really only mainland Great Britain, OSGM 15 covers the whole lot in a single model. It's all been mapped in the same model. And if you wanted to be really pedantic, you could say that OSGM 15 is not a true geoid model because it's not based purely on gravity. It started as a pure gravity-based surface, but then it was fitted to the heights of those 200 fundamental benchmarks that I showed in the earlier slide. And that's why those benchmarks are still so fundamentally important for heights in Great Britain, because there are physical relationship back to Ordnance Datum Newlyn. And for the datums in the outer islands, we chose similar points. So we took a gravity model and kind of bent it a little bit to fit our existing realization of mean sea level. So very strictly speaking, OSGM 15 should be called a height corrector surface and not a geoid model, but we retained the name just because it was easier for users. That's what we've been calling it for quite some time. So what might happen in the future? Well, first of all, one of the questions I get quite a lot is, well, mean sea levels rising? That's a fairly well-known fact. Sea levels are rising on average, and very roughly, sea level at Newlyn is now about 20 centimetres higher than it was when Ordnance Datum Newlyn was first measured 100 years ago. But that's not really significant enough to warrant a wholesale change of the datum just yet. But I think it's clear that we have to move with the times, and picking one point and one mean sea level for the entire country and hanging our entire hat on that is not really the way you would do things now, especially in the satellite age, especially that most positioning is now satellite based. So the next version of ODN is very, very likely to be just a model, a pure gravity based geoid model. No fitting to FBMs, no distortion to FBMs or anything like that. And you can choose a specific value for the strength of gravity so that your surface would align with mean sea level as it is now. So any future surface will really only be a few tens of centimetres different from Newlyn. It won't be a massive several meters wholesale change. But of course, if mean sea level does go up, or if the datum that we assign to mean sea level does go up, that means that if you like walking in Scotland, if you like bagging Munros, some of them might go down. Some of them might not be Munros anymore. If there are any that are close to that magical 3,000 foot threshold, if the underlying datum goes up a little bit, then the height of the mountain will go down by the same amount. So we might lose a Munro or two. And poor old Calf Top, which is a hill in the Yorkshire Dales, in 2010, it was measured by GPS. Some amateurs took a GPS unit up there and accurately measured its height, and it failed the magic 2,000 foot marker of becoming a mountain by just 2 centimeters. But then when we improved the model to GM15 a few years ago, the upshot was that the height change meant that it crept into becoming a mountain by 6 millimeters. So Calf Top became a mountain just by 6 millimeters. But of course, if we change the sea level datum and align it to sea level it is now, then poor old Calf Top is going to be relegated to a hill again. So those are some of the upshots, and I think that's a reasonable story to end on, I think. So thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting.
Thanks, Mark. That really was very interesting as a geologist as well. Got to throw that in. We've got a good question here from Walter. I think you've already answered it though. I think so. Okay. Walter was asking about. No. It is in the comments. So
right, okay. Let me try and see that as well somewhere.
I can read it out for you as well. Walter's asking, how do we? It's the sinking of southeast England with the isostatic. So is that answered with your gravity-based model?
Yes, kind of. This is where you get the conflict between high-end science and the practicalities of users. We're quite lucky in this country that we don't really have any significant isostatic adjustment. We're unlike our kind of Scandinavian colleagues who they have to take in the rebound as part of their height model. Most of the Scandinavian countries these days have a height model that is based on a gravity surface, but it includes a time-dependent displacement or a time-dependent distortion to try account for the fact that they're all still bouncing back after the retreat of the glaciers. Now, fortunately, in this country, we don't really have that at any significant level. On a fine scientific measurement level, there probably is a little bit. But for practical heighting, it's not really something of concern. So the short answer to that question is there's no real need to worry about that. And at the end of the day, you still need to pick a fixed point and kind of go with it for a while. So even if the new model might last another 100 years until sea levels rising and a little bit of residual isostatic rebound comes into play to mean that we have to revalue it, then so be it. But I think to get 100 years out of a model and a datum is without having to be forced to change it is fairly good.
Yeah.
To be honest, I thought the question was going to be about ocean tide loading, because Newlyn in Cornwall is kind of infamous for bouncing up and down with the tide 10 centimetres every day. As the tide comes in, the whole of Newlyn, Cornwall and Devon gets pressed down. And then as the tide goes out, it springs back up again. But that's an effect that has only become apparent and measurable with the advent of satellite positioning. So obviously, when they picked Newlyn, ocean tide loading wasn't even a thing. So that's another common question I quite often get asked about: how does ocean tide loading affect picking Newlyn for the datum site?
Okay. Well, thanks for that. So from a practical point of view, because I'm a kind of practical person, who maintains your fundamental benchmarks? Is that your job? Do you guys go out?
We do. Yeah, I mean, obviously, all the benchmarks are redundant, and in the horizontal world, the trig pillars, we don't use those anymore. But yeah, the 200 odd FBMs are really the only physical marks that we go out of our way to maintain these days, because they do still, as I said, represent that physical surface. The heights of those markers are the physical realization of ODN.
Okay. We've actually got one more question here as well from Damien. Hopefully not getting too distracted from his StreamYarding job. He's asking, is there a timeline for an updated MSL for OS based on a gravitational model?
Not as such. We are probably this year or maybe early next year, we are seriously planning the first step on that journey, which is a public consultation, because any consideration to changing ODM and moving towards a gravity-based model is tied up with similar changes in the horizontal world. So the horizontal companion to Ordnance Data of Newlyn is OSGB 36 National Grid, which is 80 odd years old. It was designed in 1936, as the name suggests. And there are similar reasons for wanting to update that system. But clearly we can't go ahead and just propose a new system without trying to gain feedback from users. What do users want? What are the impacts? What will be their advantages? What are the disadvantages? So the first step is a public consultation on those issues, and the intention is to start that ball rolling this year. But other than that, there's no hard timeline that says we will disband ODN at this point and we'll adopt a model at that point. It's still very early stages, as I say, of kind of thinking about it and consulting on it.
Okay, super. Well, look, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you'll come back on at the end in case there's any further questions.
I'm certainly going to hang around and listen to the guys from the Hydro office.
Cool. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. We are going to move on to our second speaker for tonight, who is Paul Marks. He is a product manager and GIS specialist working in the maritime industry for over 17 years at the UK Hydrographic Office. Paul is recognised by IMARIST as a registered marine scientist and has won, this is very impressive, and has won the MOD Defence Surveyors Award. So in his role as the product manager for the Admiralty Marine Data Portal and Seabed Mapping Services, he's led the development of new products and services for accessing the UKHO's marine data. Paul combines his love of user experience design with geospatial data, transforming the way people access marine location-based information with the introduction of new products and new services. So Paul's presentation this evening is titled A Brief Look at the History and the Future of Vorf Vertical Offshore Reference Frame. So without further delay, again with the powers of Damien, here we go. I shall hand over to Paul. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for taking part this evening.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you
Over
everyone.
to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nikki, for that introduction, and thank you, Mark, as well, for the interesting presentation beforehand, and thank you to you all for having me this evening. So, as Nikki says, a product manager at the UK Hydrographic Office, and I'm going to talk about Vorf, Vertical Offshore Reference Frame. Many of you may be aware of what Vorf is. You may have used it, you may not be, and I'm just going to talk us through, you know, a brief presentation outline here. We're going to talk about just briefly what is Vorf, how it was created, how it was tested, how Vorf is used, and the benefits that it provides for hydrographic surveying and beyond, and then just touch on what the future for Vorf is. So, diving in, what is Vorf? As I say, it's Vertical Offshore Reference Frame. Vorf is a set of high-resolution digital models of reference surfaces that can be then modelled against ETRF 89, and essentially it allows geospatial data to be re-referenced against a number of datums, particularly marine vertical datums, as you would expect from the Hydrographic Office. So it's a way of us relating between these marine vertical datums, as I say, and with ETRF 89 as the ellipsoid. Chart datum being very important, other tidal datums, HAT, LAT, and we've got some slides in a moment. Over, I think it's 15 land datums as well, so OS datum Newland, as mentioned by Mark, but also those various other land datums as well that we've got, so Belfast and Isle of Man and other places as well. There's a lot there, and as I say, look, it says there it covers the UK and Irish waters. So as I say, it covers the entire UK and Irish continental shelves, as well as the Channel Islands. So just to throw that in there as well. So it covers the Channel Islands, and it can convert between chart datum, any of the tidal datums at any point in this area. The sea datums, if we want to call them those, they extend approximately 1 nautical mile inland. And then the models for the land datums extend approximately 3 nautical miles offshore. So in that zone where we've got that overlap, we're then also able to convert and provide the measurement to convert between those datums in that overlap. So again, just looking at what datum does Vorf cover, as it says here in the diagram. I've mentioned chart datum, which is very important, obviously, for us in the Hydrographic Office and the production of the nautical charts, but also the 5 tidal datums, the marine datums there that are key for us as well: the highest astronomical tide, mean high water springs, mean sea level, which we've just heard a lot about from Mark, mean low water springs, and lowest astronomical tide as well. and then I've mentioned it was 14 land datums. Apologies, I think I said 15. I was getting ahead of myself. And also 2 GNSS related datums as well. So that ETRF and also ITRF 2000 as well. So the models, I should say, within Vorf. And so Vorf is not necessarily one thing, it's a set of models. There's a GUI, there's output, there's all sorts there, but Vorf allows this ability for us to easily manipulate, but allows us to re-reference geospatial data between those reference frames. So what resolution is the Vorf data? The model. So the model and the nodes within the model, they were modeled at 0.008 degree intervals. Sorry, get that right, which is about 900 meters in latitude, depending on what latitude you are, and about 500 meters in longitude due to projection. And the model can then, or is used then to interpolate, calculate a value at any of the locations between nodes. And what we found then is we've increased the resolution, which just unfortunately dropped off the slide there, but where the tidal regime is more complex, so along rivers, estuaries, etc., there's a higher resolution grid as well within that model, and that's approximately 225 meters in latitude, 120 in longitude. So a more high resolution where the node points, and these nodes are where essentially the calculation was taking place. And this is, one thing that I haven't mentioned is, Vorf, and I will mention further, University College London working closely in developing this model with the UKHO and on our behalf. And one of the interesting things was when calculating the data and the calculations for each one of those nodes. At the time, it took all of UCL's distributed computing power. This is kind of pre-cloud. The entire weekend, it took up that entire compute power for the entire weekend to calculate the initial model for Vorf, or the models, I should say, for Vorf. So we talked about the output, the output. We've talked about the model there, and the Vorf output, and this really is, I suppose, I was going to say the useful element. This is the bit that really can help externally and internally and users. So internally, the UKHO, we have a Vorf GUI, which gives us access to the models, allows us to kind of run the calculations and pull the information out. And you can see a screenshot in the middle there of that. Externally, for users, we allow via the Vorf data service, which is at the bottom there, users can download .vrf files, so essentially text files in effect, but Vorf files, and these are 10 kilometer square blocks of Vorf data points. So they're not the nodes specifically, but these are data points, and they're very close essentially to where the nodes. They're 800 meters apart, spaced, and within each of the delimited text files, as it says there, there's longitude, latitude. I was going to say, bizarrely, there's something, a field called new depth, which is effectively the separation value. It's a quirk of kind of how the data is produced that it calls it new depth, unfortunately, but it's a separation value in meters. And I'm not sure if you can see on your screens at all, but in the example on screen there, it's 56 point something meters for each one of those points there that you've got available. Also that we've got there is then the uncertainty value as well, which is really key. This is then a value is, I think in the example 0.125, but and will vary for each one of those data points. And when we went through the testing and the creation of Vorf, we had very clear accuracies that we wanted Vorf to perform to, for it to be fit for purpose for how we wanted to use Vorf, and how we would want others to be able to use Vorf with a certain level of certainty. And the uncertainty values there, we'll talk about that through the testing in a moment, fall below 0.15 effectively, but every data point is given that uncertainty to again help with the calculations that the end user will be able to make with it. I've put a couple of links in there where you can find out more information about Vorf. You can access the data as well if you wanted to. So you can go to our data hub, the Marine Data Portal, where you would then be able to access the Vorf data service and be able to access that data. So that was kind of a quick run through, hopefully, of kind of what Vorf is. If you haven't kind of come across it, it's hopefully you can see how useful it can be. But one of the interesting was kind of how it was created and how Vorf was created. And as I mentioned, this was work that was done predominantly by University College London, UCL, working with us. And Vorf was created using a number of data sources, tide gauge data, GPS, as it was, GNS data, satellite altimetry data being key, gravity field models like the Geoid, and glad Mark was on first because you'll actually see an example here of it being used as well, and tidal modeling as well coming into that. So a number of factors being brought together to then be calculated for each of those nodes to create those models. So one of the first things was using the permanent service for mean sea level gauges, which is, so it's tying in nicely with Mark's talk. But we've got high accuracy, long time series of measurements, but a low density. They're spaced around the country there. You can see in the map on screen. It's quite low density. So to be able to get the right amount of data to be able to produce the model, we then needed to fill that in, and we're using Admiralty tide table gauges as well. They're lower accuracy, shorter time series, but a higher density, and also key, the only definition really of chart datum. So it was key to be able to bring that in as well. And you can see how, as we're now building up the data, so we've built up the tide gauge information around the coast, but unfortunately, some of those tide gauges didn't actually have a connection to any of the standard vertical datums. So we had tide gauges, but no connection to the vertical datum at all. And this is where we were able to then go out and carry out GPS observations at those locations and provide the connection. Very much, fortunately, like Mark just described in the previous talk. So one of the key then pieces of data to enable Vorf to have a vertical offshore reference frame was satellite altimetry data. This provided high accuracy data into the model, but data that does degrade as you get closer to the shore. The altimeter starts to sense the land, and unfortunately that throws it. So that leaves approximately a 15-kilometer gap around any land. But as I say, we've got the tide gauge, we've got the altimetry data. We're beginning to piece and pull this puzzle together to build it. The next aspect of data that came in, as it says there, the gravity field models, Vorf uses OSGM02, and as Mark just mentioned, OSGM15 is actually there. Vorf hasn't been recomputed to incorporate the latest OSGM models. At present, that hasn't affected the accuracies and the uncertainties within Vorf. And kind of, again, referring back to Mark's talk, but there isn't enough at the moment to need that recompute, but clearly it's going to need to happen as we progress and go forward in time. So that is something that does need to kind of come into the Vorf model as we progress. But that was used, so that's to be aware of it as you're using data. So we've produced these models. We've got some great stuff, and we've got these surfaces. But one thing that was needed is, kind of how do we test this? How do we ensure that Vorf is fit for purpose? And especially in a world of, as all of you are much more qualified and aware, isn't necessarily as I was going to say as easy as land with water, and there's a lot more going on. How are we going to test that? How are we going to be ensure that it's fit for purpose and good for use? Well, fortunately, testing took over 4 years really. Final delivery, and I'll touch on kind of the timeline in a moment. Final delivery, it was in 2012 for Vorf, and that's really when operational use came in. without validation. And so for 4 years, through the Civil Hydrography Programme, and so, you know, credit for the Civil Hydrography Programme identifying how useful Vorf can be, and asking via the MCA survey contractors to validate Vorf at the beginning of surveys, to be able to provide those comparisons between observed and the Vorf model. That enabled us to create a network of validation that then led to the operational use of Vorf. So being able to effectively test it in anger, in you know, use, you know, getting people to be able to use it and validate it, meant that then we could be much more certain, and we can then bring it in. That wasn't the only testing. There was a lot more testing as well before it got to kind of that validation, as it mentions here. You know, 245 checks on datum connections, and mostly coastal points. 63 comparisons between Vorf corrected tidal levels and observed with GNS and tide gauge data. 6 commercial, specially commissioned offshore tide gauges deployments, and as I've already mentioned in the uncertainty, all of this testing led really to showing that Vorf surfaces met their target accuracies of 0.1 meters inshore and 0.15 meters offshore. So that's the formal uncertainties, and Vorf was providing calculations that fell under those target accuracies. So, and also, as it says there, you know, when we're validating, it actually showed that the errors were a fair reflection of what was actually encountered. So I've kind of gone on, said lots of different things, maybe from different angles, because Vorf was, there's been a lot going on and quite complex, but here we've got just a timeline, hopefully, that will help set the scene of where it came from. So as I say, 2005 was the time when the idea was conceived, should we say. The project starts, and that project starts with UCL, University College London, asked to develop the Vorf model, and you know, them working, really hard working, pulling all of that data that we've just talked about, how Vorf was created, led to 2008 when the completed model, with a recompute where I spoke earlier about the nodes and the increased resolution around rivers and estuaries. That was something that was needed to ensure that actually we noticed some, I wouldn't say errors, but variation that meant that we needed a denser resolution for the model in those areas. So that was recomputed and delivered in 2008. And that's when the testing and the validation begins. And as I say, 4 years of kind of validating through the Civil Hydrography Programme, sorry, always get my words mixed up there, meant that we were able to validate that. And it was in 2012 when our internal product safety board, and they're really keen to make sure, you know, everything is safe for use with, you know, safety of life at sea and charts and the publications and things, and they approved the use of Vorf and kind of rubber stamped it. And that was a key moment because that kind of triggered a couple of activities that, you know, Vorf Global came about, and Vorf Global really was from the Royal Navy identifying that Vorf had a use and was you know, useful. It's now signed off as safe and things, and they asked again UCL and commissioned, and it was delivered a Vorf Global, not quite the same as Vorf for the UK, if we call it Vorf UK for a moment, but you know, it's not the same, but it kind of does the same job. It's much more kind of aimed at, as you can see there, the kind of oceans as opposed to coastal areas. So that's an RN thing and sits there. But also, you know, with that kind of approval and the sign off, it led really to the academic paper as well, which I would recommend, actually, if anyone wanted to kind of look and really understand a lot more about Vorf, how it was created, and that co-authored paper between the UK Hydrographic Office and UCL was also released then in 2013. In 2019 is when we moved to having a self-serve web app or website to allow customers to select and download blocks of Vorf data, which I mentioned earlier. So this now gives that ability for people to able to access and download and purchase Vorf blocks. So just a bit now on kind of Vorf and how it's used, and obviously, I've mentioned it's used within the Hydrographic Office, and one of the key benefits of Vorf, one of the key things in the efficiency and the consistency of hydrographic surveys is that Vorf allows the acquisition data by the GNS with respect to the ellipsoid, and then transforming it to the chart datum, and it eliminates the need for the tidal observations. And so that's a great thing. As it says, it's much more efficient potentially. It's much easier, quicker to be able to do it. It gives consistency as well. So different, maybe tidal observations at different times may come with different results, rather than kind of effectively using Vorf, which would give you a consistent between the ellipsoid and then chart datum. So you're getting that consistency, and predominantly this is how Vorf has been used, and for the last decade, 2012, that's predominantly how Vorf has really been used. When Vorf was first thought up, though, as well, it also raised the possibility that Vorf provides the link between terrestrial and marine data, and may be able to help with that kind of data on different datums in the kind of terrestrial world, marine world, and atmospheric as well data that may come in. And it didn't quite get a lot of use, but actually increasingly there's more use in this world, and certainly more renewable energy, more development in that zone, where more and more data that especially kind of needing to bring atmospheric data and marine data together in that coastal zone, Vorf is actually becoming really useful, and this use case now is really beginning to develop a bit more. The third use case and the third eye was really one for the future still, and still is for the future. So some of you may be aware and be aware of the IHO's S100 framework and the future navigation standards and data standards that are coming under that framework. And if you're not, then by all means, visit our website, admiralty.co.uk, but also the IHO's website. You can find out more information there about those standards coming and future navigation. But in this world of future navigation, we can see there being a potential use case for real-time navigation, with GNS on board, an onboard transformation from satellite datum to chart datum, and that potentially starts to give you more accurate underkill clearance, and starts to kind of layer in increasingly the efficiencies for shipping, the increase in data potentially. So yeah, this isn't one that hasn't happened yet, but certainly we could see there being potential in the future for this, for shipping, for autonomous, for a number of different use cases in that environment. So as promised, I've kind of hopefully given you a brief on how what Vorf is, how it's been created, tested, how it's been used, and now what the future is for Vorf. As I mentioned, it's really useful, it's key, it's really showing how important and how useful it can be in this environment, and in those use cases. But as I mentioned, using OS GM02 currently within the Vorf model, it needs to be recomputed. It's not inaccurate at the moment or anything like that. But as kind of to Mark's point as well, as time goes on different ways of kind of calculating, building these models, they need to be refreshed. Unfortunately, it won't be around for 100 years like OS ODN potentially. So you know, it's going to need to be refreshed, and I think that's key for Vorf. But increasingly as well, as a product manager, and as it was mentioned, kind of from a user point of view, I'm very keen that actually this becomes you know, a really useful tool and something that people can access. And so improving that way that people can access that data, whether it be through potentially API access and web services or other means, that's definitely something to investigate. And also, I've put there alternative outputs, but, you know, we looked there was the gridded data output, but potentially, you know, kind of spot calculations. You know, I just want the calculation in this location, and can you provide it, that kind of thing, and be able to pull that through easily for users. So I think there's alternative outputs and improved access that we can be doing and looking at as we progress and go forward with Vorf. And I think also expanding the coverage. So I briefly mentioned Vorf Global, but this isn't suggesting necessarily global coverage, but certainly looking at expanding that coverage and where it would be useful. You know, from a UK government kind of perspective, we obviously have overseas territories and crown dependencies and such like, and you know, just looking at how the coverage can be expanded to again provide the best service for users and customers. So that's thank you. That's me done with that. So if there's any questions, I know David is joining us tonight as well, so I'm sure he might be able to answer anything in the chat that I'm not. And I'm also joined by Andy Talbot as well, who is the bathymetry advisor at the UK Hydrographic Office. So if there's any more technical questions, should we say, that probably go over my head, hopefully those guys might be able to answer them as well.
Thanks, Paul. That was super interesting.
Thank you.
Really was. And love the picture of your new building as well. That looks superb. Very nice.
Yes. Well, hopefully, I believe the intention may be that there might be a Hydrographic Society event at the new building. I believe I might be talking out of turn, but I'm certainly hope that you know. We got the new building, and then unfortunately COVID came along, didn't it? And so yeah, some events would be nice to get people to kind of come and see our new building and show it off a bit.
Well, we look forward to that invitation, and we will be happy to send a delegation down from Aberdeen down to. That looks super. Well, David is in the chat, and it looks like you owe him a gin and tonic because he's answered one of Walter's questions. For you, which was about the datum, what datum is used. So thank you, David, for answering that in the chat. So there was another question from Walter as well, which was to do with the early days of Vorf, when there wasn't very much data, and for observations from the coast, and the Hydrographic Office were looking for data from other sources like oil and gas platforms. And Walter's asking how successful was that kind of cry for data? Did you get any help?
I am hopefully Andy. Unfortunately, I can't see if Andy has joined the call or not.
I think I'm just on now.
Yes, you are.
Just arrived.
Blocked momentarily by the question popping up. I'm going to apologise because unfortunately I wasn't involved with Vorf, so I don't know, Andy, if you're able to provide an answer to Walter on that particular question.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what that's referring to, but I think it was probably when we were in that sort of validation phase, and we were looking for as much data as we could to kind of validate Vorf. I think that's what it was around. So it wasn't that it was less accurate or more accurate than it is now. It's still the same model, still the same computation from back in 2008. But as I say, there was that period of time when we were trying to basically get as much data as we could, tidal data, to prove the model in as many locations as we could. So that was one source I think we were going out to. And I don't think we got a lot of data, as far as I know, from that source. But we did get a lot from like the civil hydrography program anyway. You know, we got a lot of points. I think it was over 200 checks or something like that. So we had ample validation, you know, around UK waters anyway. So yeah, and it took 4 years, so it did take quite a long time anyway. Yeah.
Okay. So my question was to go back to the very beginning, back in 2005, when UCL started the program. It's like what drove that decision to start the project in the first place? Was there a commercial drive, or was it purely UCL saying, hey, let's have a closer look at this, let's see what we can do, let's be smart about this? You know, what was there some external driving force to that project?
Yeah, it was a concept that it came out of the UKHO, and basically UCL were kind of commissioned to do the work for us, and it was right around the time I joined, and it was really about sort of moving into that sort of digital age, I think, really, and having data that was interoperable and so on. And we were designing new sort of digital databases at the time, we wanted data to be able to be transformable in the vertical sense between all the different sort of sources of data that we get, because we receive data that sometimes on mean sea level, sometimes on land datums, sometimes on LAT, which is like chart datum, but chart datum is a bit of a strange beast in itself. It's very much a hydrographic datum that is just an arbitrary picked thing, really. You LAT and then perhaps take a bit more off just to be safe. So it's not often mathematically defined, and it's by definition it's for a chart. It's for that shape of that chart. That's what it's originally from. But if you're going to go into a digital age where data is going to become more seamless, you know, you can't have that you know, you need some sort of more common standard and level to be able to transform data vertically from, you know, all the different sources we're getting. So that's kind of where it came from, back in 2004 when it was being conceived, really. And its sort of use now in surveying wasn't really thought of at the time. The fact that you can go out and do a survey using GNSS, survey to the ellipsoid, and not worry about a tide gauge, and then transform your data from reference to the ellipsoid to chart datum, you know, later on, that sort of has come about since, sort of thing, really, as another use, because GNSS has got more accurate, basically, and you know, the accuracy is more accessible offshore.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Damien actually asked another question, which I think David has answered, but I'll ask it again, if that's okay, which was, is the S100 IHO initiative intended to be a subscription service?
So the IHO S100 is a universal hydrographic data model, I believe they would call it, and really is the IHO putting together new standards for future navigation, should we say. You know, it's a model for creating standardized data that will be fit for, you know, kind of future model, and so it's going beyond the current S57 and the electronic navigation charts currently, and it's looking to broaden, you know, kind of its scope and coverage. So the IHO, the S100 itself isn't really a subscription service. It is the models and the product specifications and the formats, the data standards to produce data that will be safe for navigation, etc. You know, the services then that are created by hydrographic offices, you know, through ranks and then through the value-added resellers. They may be subscription services as they are today, you know, with S57 and such like. So hasn't quite got into that world yet of exactly what the end service will be
what it will
from these
look
data
like.
models. It's still at the moment about, you know, kind of creating the right data for standards. So there's one for S102 for bathymetric surfaces. There's S104 for, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's tidal. I forget whether it's the tidal stream. That's S111, I think, is tidal stream. You know, there's all sorts that are actually kind of covered. There's S121 for maritime limits, I believe. You know, there's all kinds of standards now that for standardizing that marine data for navigation.
Okay. Well, that kind of leaves it open for a part 2 then, Paul and Andy. You can come back and give us an update.
Yeah, definitely. Be a pleasure to come back at any point and, you know, and provide you
come
with,
to Aberdeen.
With an update, or come in person next time, and be able to talk about either an update with Vorf or any of the other kind of seabed services that I look after. Be quite happy to kind of come and present again. But also, I'd just like to say, you know, whilst I've got, you know, a group of people here, you know, if anyone has thoughts on kind of future Vorf use, you know, they use Vorf, or they want to, or they have some particular kind of need, then, you know, please do get in touch with me or through David or you know, through the society at all. Yeah, please do reach out and let me know.
Perfect. Well, thank you both. And so, by some miracle and good grace of the hydrographic gods, we seem to have made it through without any technical hitches that I'm aware of. Whether we've just been talking to ourselves remains to be seen. But can you bring Mark back in, Damien? There he is. There he is. Hello, Mark.
Sorry, I was muted. Hello.
It's okay. It's okay. So I would like to thank Paul and Mark for their time tonight. Thank you very much. And Andy as well for joining us. Really, really interesting. Great to kind of get back to those basics and have all that, or have all that presented. I'd also like to thank our man in the background there working his magic, Damien. Fantastic job. Thank you for keeping us all in check tonight. I'd like to thank our newly elected office bearers and the committee for 2022. Thank you very much. Really, really looking forward to this next year, and just hope that we can move from FaceTime to actual FaceTime rather than this digital time is becoming quite tiresome. So look, I appreciate everybody's time tonight. And unless there's any other comments that anybody would like to make, Paul, Mark, Andy, anything you'd like to add? No?
No, just thank you very much.
Yeah,
well, I think we will say then, thanks very much to everybody, and good night from Aberdeenshire.